I haven't had a man in 2 years, the neighbor confessed by the fence. Would you help me with that? James had been living in the quiet neighborhood for about 8 months now. The divorce was finally behind him, but the emptiness it left was something he was still learning to live with. His days had become predictable. Wake up, go to work, come home, maybe watch some television, and sleep. Weekends were spent doing small repairs around the house or working in the garden. It kept him busy, and that was enough for now. His next-door neighbor was a woman named Rita. She was in her early 40s, always polite whenever they ran into each other. James knew she was a widow. The previous owner of his house had mentioned it during the sale. Her husband had passed away from illness a few years back. Since then, she lived alone in that big house with just her dog for company. James felt quiet sympathy for her, though they never talked about anything deep, but just the usual neighbor stuff. Those tomatoes are coming in nice. Have a good day. It was a Saturday afternoon in May when everything changed. James was outside trimming the hedge that separated their properties. The sun was warm, and he was enjoying the physical work. It gave him something to focus on besides his thoughts. Rita came out to her garden, wearing old jeans and a faded shirt, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She waved, and James waved back. She started weeding her flower bed, and they made small talk across the fence. She asked about his week. He asked about her plans for the garden. Normal conversation. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then Rita stopped pulling weeds, brushed the dirt off her hands, and walked closer to the fence. There was something different in her expression. Nervous, maybe. Her hands were fidgeting with her gardening gloves. Desperation. James noticed the shift in her mood, but didn't think much of it at first. Maybe she wanted to borrow something. Maybe she had a question about the neighborhood. He put down his pruning shears and walked over to meet her at the fence. Rita looked down at her feet for a moment, then back up at him. Her cheeks were slightly red. She took a breath, and then just said it. No warning, no let-up. She told him she hadn't been with a man in 2 years. Not since her husband died. She said the loneliness was becoming too much to handle. And then she asked if James would help her with that. James felt like the ground had disappeared beneath him. His mind went blank. He stood there, staring at her, not sure if he'd heard correctly. Did she just ask what he thought she asked? Rita's face turned even redder as the seconds ticked by. She looked away, clearly regretting her words the moment they left her mouth. He tried to say something, anything, but all that came out was a confused stammer. His heart was pounding. This wasn't something he'd ever expected. Not from Rita. Not from anyone, really. He wasn't even sure how he felt about it. Shocked, definitely. But also something else he couldn't quite name. Rita quickly apologized, her words tumbling out in a rush. She said she shouldn't have said that. She didn't know what she was thinking. She turned and hurried back toward her house, leaving James standing there alone by the fence, still holding his gardening gloves. That night, James couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He replayed the conversation over and over in his mind. The look on Rita's face, the vulnerability in her voice, the way she'd rushed away afterward. He felt bad for her. It took courage to say something like that, even if it was awkward and unexpected. But what was he supposed to do now? Pretend it never happened? Talk to her about it? Avoid her completely? He lay in bed staring at the ceiling. wondering if Rita was doing the same thing in the house next door. The whole situation felt impossible. They were neighbors. They had to see each other almost every day. How were they supposed to move past this? The more James thought about it, the more he realized he didn't even know what he wanted. Yes, Rita was attractive. She was kind. She seemed like a good person. But was this really about attraction? Or was it just two lonely people desperate for connection? And if something did happen between them, what then? They lived right next to each other. If things went wrong, there'd be no escaping the awkwardness. James rolled over and tried to force himself to sleep, but his mind wouldn't settle. Tomorrow he decided he'd figure out what to do. But tonight all he could do was wonder what Rita was thinking, and whether that conversation by the fence had just ruined the only friendly relationship he had in this neighborhood. The next few days were some of the most uncomfortable James had experienced in a long time. Every time he thought about going outside, he'd peek through the window first to make sure Rita wasn't in her yard. He felt ridiculous doing it, like a teenager avoiding someone at school, but he couldn't help it. He didn't know what to say to her. He didn't even know how to act normal anymore. Rita seemed to be doing the same thing. Her car would pull into the driveway, and she'd rush from the car to her front door without looking around. Her garden, which she usually tended every evening, sat untouched. The whole situation had created this weird tension that hung in the air between their houses. By Wednesday, James was feeling frustrated with himself. This was silly. They were adults. They needed to deal with this somehow. But every time he thought about knocking on her door, his courage failed him. What would he even say? It was easier to just keep avoiding the problem. That evening, James called his younger brother Danny. They talked every week, usually about nothing important: sports, work, family gossip. But this time, James needed actual advice. After they'd covered the usual topics, James took a breath and told Danny what had happened. Danny was quiet for a moment, then let out a low whistle. "Wow, that's heavy," he said. "What did you say to her?" "Nothing really. I just stood there, like an idiot." "Then she ran off. And you haven't talked to her since?" "No. We've been avoiding each other." Danny asked the question James had been trying not to think about. "Do you like her? I mean, are you interested?" James didn't have a good answer. "I don't know. Rest. Maybe? She's nice. She's pretty. But it's complicated." "Everything's complicated," Danny said. "The question is, what do you actually want here?" That was the problem. James didn't know. He'd been so focused on processing the shock of Rita's confession that he hadn't stopped to consider his own feelings. Was he attracted to her? Sure. But was that enough? And even if it was, could he handle getting involved with someone who lived right next door? If things didn't work out, he'd have to see her every single day. Danny listened as James worked through his thoughts out loud.
"Here's what I think," Danny finally said. "You need to talk to her. Not about whether you're going to sleep with her or date her or whatever. Just talk to her like a person."
"She's probably embarrassed and scared right now. And you're clearly stressed about it."
James knew his brother was right.
The avoidance was only making things worse. Whatever was going to happen between him and Rita, it needed to start with an actual conversation. On Thursday evening, James made a decision. He showered, changed into clean clothes, and grabbed a bottle of wine from his kitchen. It was one of the nicer bottles he'd been saving for a special occasion. This wasn't exactly special, but it felt like the kind of conversation that required something more than showing up empty-handed. He walked across his lawn and up Rita's front steps. His heart was hammering in his chest. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. What if she didn't want to talk? What if this made things even worse? But he'd come this far. He knocked. Rita opened the door a moment later. Her eyes widened when she saw him standing there. She looked like she might close the door, but then she saw the wine bottle and seemed to relax just slightly. "Can we talk?" James asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Rita hesitated, then nodded. She stepped aside and led him in, leading him through her house to the back porch. They sat in her outdoor chairs, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. James could hear crickets chirping and the distant sound of a dog barking. The evening air was cool and comfortable. Finally, Rita broke the silence. "I'm so sorry about what I said. I was completely out of line." "I understand if you're uncomfortable. I'll try to stay out of your way from now on." James shook his head. "That's not why I'm here." "I don't want us to avoid each other. We're neighbors. I just think we need to talk about what happened." Rita looked down at her hands. "I've been seeing a therapist," she said quietly, "since my husband died. She's been encouraging me to be more direct about what I need, to stop hiding from life. But I took it too far. I'd been so lonely, and you're kind, and I thought maybe—" She trailed off, clearly embarrassed. James set the wine bottle down on the small table between them. Desp. "I get it. I've been lonely too. The divorce really messed me up. And honestly, I think you're great, but I don't know if either of us is in the right place for what you were suggesting." Rita nodded, relief visible on her face. At least he wasn't angry. At least he understood. They kept talking as the sun went down. James told her about his marriage, how it had slowly fallen apart, how he'd felt like a failure. Rita talked about losing her husband, about the grief that still hit her at unexpected moments, about how hard it was to imagine ever being close to someone again. They talked for 3 hours, sharing things they hadn't told anyone else. After that conversation on Rita's porch, something shifted between them. The awkwardness didn't disappear completely, but it transformed into something else. Something that felt like the beginning of an actual friendship. They started seeing each other more regularly, but in a completely different way than Rita had originally suggested. Sunday mornings became their coffee time. James would walk over to Rita's house around 9, and they'd sit on her porch with their mugs, talking about whatever came to mind. And sometimes it was light conversation about the neighborhood or television shows they were watching. Other times, it was deeper. That they talked about their fears, their regrets, the things they wished they'd done differently in their lives. Rita introduced James to her dog, a golden retriever named Biscuit, who immediately decided James was his new best friend. James would bring vegetables from his garden and Rita would share tomatoes and peppers from hers. It became a routine, this easy back and forth between their two houses. Phew. Friday nights turned into movie nights. They'd alternate houses each week. James would make popcorn, or Rita would order pizza. They'd pick something neither of them had seen before and settle in to watch. Breath. Sometimes they'd talk through the whole movie, making comments and jokes. Other times they'd sit in comfortable silence, just enjoying the company. James found himself thinking about Rita more often. Not in an uncomfortable way, but in a way that made him smile. He'd be at work and remember something funny she'd said. He'd be grocery shopping and wonder if she needed anything. It was nice having someone to care about again. Someone who cared about him in return. Rita seemed lighter too. The sadness that had been in her eyes when James first met her had started to fade. Breath. She laughed more. She seemed more present, more engaged with life. Her garden began to flourish again because she was spending time in it, not hiding from her neighbor. One Saturday, they decided to tackle a project together. Rita's fence in the backyard had several loose boards that needed replacing. James offered to help, and they spent the afternoon working side by side. It was hot, sweaty work, but they joked and talked the whole time. Rita proved to be handy with tools, which surprised James. She explained that her husband had taught her basic carpentry before he got sick. As they worked, James became aware of little things. The way Rita pushed her hair back when it fell in her face. The sound of her laugh when he made a terrible joke. The way she concentrated when she was lining up a nail. He tried not to think too much about it. They were friends. Good friends. That was enough. But then there were moments when their hands would brush while reaching for the same tool. When they'd both reach for the water bottle at the same time and their fingers would touch. James would feel a small electric jolt, and he'd wonder if Rita felt it too. She never said anything, and neither did he. By late summer, they had fallen into a pattern that felt natural and comfortable. They were part of each other's daily lives. When James had a bad day at work, Rita was the person he wanted to talk to. When Rita got good news about her niece's college acceptance, James was the first person she called. One evening in August, they were cooking dinner together at Rita's house. Oration. They'd started doing this once or twice a week, experimenting with recipes they found online. This particular night, they were attempting homemade pasta. It was messier than they'd expected, and they were both covered in flour. James was rolling out dough while Rita prepared the sauce. They were laughing about something silly when they both reached for the kitchen towel at the same time. Their hands touched, and this time neither of them pulled away. James looked up and found Rita watching him. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt charged with something neither of them could ignore anymore. James's hand moved from the towel to Rita's cheek. His fingers were gentle, questioning. Rita leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for just a moment. But when she opened them again, they were standing closer than before. James wasn't sure who moved first. Maybe they both did. But then they were kissing, soft and tentative at first, then deeper. Months of friendship, of shared loneliness, of growing affection, all came together in that moment. It felt right in a way that surprised them both. When they finally pulled apart, Rita was smiling, not the nervous, embarrassed smile from that day at the fence months ago. This was genuine happiness. James felt it too, a warmth spreading through his chest that he hadn't felt in years. They didn't rush anything. They finished making dinner together, stealing glances and small touches as they cooked. They ate and talked like they always did, but everything felt different now. Better. When James finally went home that night, he couldn't stop smiling. And when he looked out his window, he could see the light on in Rita's bedroom and knew she was probably smiling too. The morning after that first kiss, James woke up feeling something he hadn't experienced in a very long time. He got ready for a Sunday morning coffee with Rita. But this time, there was a nervous excitement mixed in. What would it be like now? Would things be awkward? Had they moved too fast? When Rita opened her door, any worries James had melted away. Breath. She smiled at him the same way she had been smiling for months, but with something extra now, something warm and knowing. They settled into their usual spots on her porch with their coffee, and Biscuit curled up at their feet. They talked about what had happened in the kitchen. Both admitted they'd been feeling something growing between them for weeks, but had been too scared to act on it. Rita confessed she'd been worried about ruining their friendship. James admitted he'd been afraid of getting hurt again, but somehow the kiss had felt natural, paid, like it was supposed to happen. They decided to take things slowly. There was no rush. They'd built a good foundation as friends, and neither wanted to mess that up by moving too fast. Rita was still working through her grief, even though it had been years since her husband's death. James was still healing from his divorce. They both needed time to make sure this was real and not just two lonely people reaching for comfort. Over the next few weeks, their relationship deepened. They still did all the things they'd been doing as friends, but now there were small moments of affection woven in. A kiss goodbye when James left for work. Breath. Holding hands while watching movies. Sitting closer together during their coffee mornings. But it wasn't all easy. James had moments when he pulled back, when his fear of being hurt again made him retreat into himself. There were times when he'd cancel plans or become distant. Rita, patient and understanding, would give him space but also gently call him out when he was running away from something good. Rita had her own struggles. Sometimes she'd look at James and feel a wave of guilt. Was she betraying her husband's memory by being with someone new? Was it too soon? Her therapist reminded her that moving forward wasn't forgetting the past. Her husband would have wanted her to be happy, but the guilt still crept in at unexpected moments. They talked through everything. That was the advantage of having built a friendship first. They knew how to communicate. When James felt scared, he told Rita instead of just disappearing. When Rita felt guilty, she shared those feelings instead of letting them fester. They worked through each obstacle together. The neighbors started to notice that James and Rita were spending a lot of time together. In a small community, people talk. Some were happy for them knowing both had been through difficult times. Brace. Others were more judgmental, whispering about how quick it seemed. Rita and James tried not to let it bother them, but sometimes the gossip stung. One particularly hard moment came when Rita's sister-in-law visited. She'd been close to Rita's late husband, and seeing Rita with James upset her. She made comments about how Rita was replacing her brother, how it hadn't been that long. Rita tried to explain that this wasn't about replacement, but her sister-in-law wasn't ready to hear it. The visit ended badly, with harsh words and hurt feelings. James held Rita while she cried that night. He understood family complications. His own ex-wife had made things difficult when she found out he was seeing someone. Not because she wanted him back, but because she seemed angry that he was moving on. These outside pressures tested them, but somehow they made it through each challenge. By fall, they'd fallen into a rhythm that worked for both of them. Some nights James stayed over at Rita's house. Other nights they slept in their own beds. There was no pressure to define what they were or where this was going. They were just two people who cared about each other, taking it one day at a time. One evening they were sitting on James's porch, watching the sunset. Rita leaned against him, and James had his arm around her shoulders. It was peaceful, comfortable. This was what he'd been missing all those months after his divorce. Not just romance or physical closeness, but real companionship. Bust. Someone who understood him and accepted him, flaws and all. I never thought I'd feel this way again, Rita said quietly. After everything, I thought I was done with this part of life. James kissed the top of her head. Me too. I was ready to just be alone forever. I'm glad you weren't, Rita said. I'm glad you had the courage to say something that day, even if it was awkward as hell. Rita laughed. Oh, God, I was so embarrassed. I can't believe I actually asked you that. Well, it worked out eventually. Just took us a few months to get here. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned orange and pink. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. And that was more than either of them had hoped for when this whole thing started. Brehead. As winter approached, James and Rita's relationship continued to grow stronger. They'd been together for several months now, and the initial nervousness had settled into something solid and real. They still had their individual spaces, their own homes, but they spent more time together than apart. James started keeping a toothbrush and some clothes at Rita's house. Rita had her own drawer in James's dresser. These small integrations of their lives happened naturally, without much discussion. It just made sense. Why go home to change when you had clothes at her place? Breaths. Why drive home late at night when you could just stay over? The holidays brought new challenges. James's family invited both of them to Thanksgiving dinner. It was the first time Rita would meet most of his relatives, and she was nervous. James's ex-wife would be there too, picking up their adult kids. It had the potential to be incredibly awkward. But James's family welcomed Rita warmly. His mother was especially kind, pulling Rita aside to thank her for making her son smile again. The ex-wife was civil, which was all they could ask for. By the end of the night, Rita felt like she'd passed some kind of test. She belonged in this part of James's life. Christmas was harder for Rita. It had always been her favorite holiday with her late husband. They'd had traditions, special decorations, a certain way of doing things. Doing it all differently with James felt wrong, but trying to recreate the past felt worse. They compromised by creating some new traditions while Rita kept a few of the old ones that meant the most to her. One cold January evening, James and Rita were at her place making dinner, when James brought up something he'd been thinking about. His house was nice, but it was bigger than he needed. Rita's house had more character, a better yard, and honestly, he spent more time there anyway.
What if he sold his place and moved in with her?
Rita froze in the middle of chopping vegetables. They'd talked about the future in vague terms, but this was concrete. This was a real commitment.
She asked if he was sure.
Rasp. Moving in together was a big step. What if things didn't work out? What if they drove each other crazy? James understood her concerns. He had the same ones. But he also knew that what they had was worth the risk. They weren't kids rushing into something blind. They were adults who had been through loss and pain and knew what they wanted. And what he wanted was to build a life with her. They talked about it for weeks. The practical concerns, the emotional ones, what it would mean for both of them. Rita talked to her therapist about it. Skate. James discussed it with his brother. They made lists of pros and cons. They were careful and thoughtful about the decision. In March, James put his house on the market. It sold faster than expected, and suddenly the move was real. They combined households, which meant sorting through belongings, deciding what to keep and what to donate. James's furniture mixed with Rita's. Their books ended up on the same shelves. It was messy and chaotic and sometimes frustrating, but they worked through it together. There were adjustments to make. James learned that Rita liked the house very cold at night. Rita discovered that James was terrible about putting dishes in the dishwasher. They had their first real fight about whose turn it was to walk the dog in the rain. But they also learned how to apologize, how to compromise, how to live together without losing themselves. By summer, they'd settled into their new normal. James no longer thought of it as Rita's house. It was their home. They planted a garden together, combining his vegetables with her flowers. Inspiration. They hosted dinner parties for friends and family. They were building a life. One Saturday morning, they were having coffee on the porch like they'd been doing since the beginning. Biscuit was sprawled across both their feet. The garden was in full bloom. Everything felt peaceful and right. Rita looked over at James and smiled. You know what's funny? I was so desperate that day by the fence. So lonely I didn't care how it sounded. I just wanted someone, anyone, to make the pain go away. James took her hand. And now I'm glad it happened the way it did. If you'd said yes right away, it would have been just about the loneliness. We would have missed all of this. James agreed. What they had now was so much better than what Rita had asked for that day. They'd built something real, based on friendship and trust and genuine care for each other. The physical part was wonderful, but it was just one piece of a much bigger picture. They never officially got engaged or married. Neither felt the need for it. They'd both been married before, and the legal status didn't matter to them. What mattered was the commitment they made to each other, every day. The choice to stay, to work through problems, to build a future together. Looking back, James sometimes thought about that moment by the fence. How shocked he'd been. How awkward and impossible it had all seemed. Rita had been brave enough to be vulnerable, even if her timing and approach had been all wrong. And James had been wise enough to take a step back and figure out what he really wanted. They'd taken the long road to get here, but it was the right road. They'd built a foundation strong enough to last. And while they couldn't predict the future, they knew they'd face it together. Two people who had been broken and lonely, who had found each other in the most unexpected way, who had taken a chance on building something new. Sometimes the best things in life start with awkward conversations by garden fences. Sometimes courage looks like saying the wrong thing but starting the right conversation. And sometimes home isn't a place you find. It's what you build with someone willing to build it with you.